Hey everyone, welcome to Crank It Up Podcast, the YouTube home of bringing games. I'm Jim Price.
And I'm Eric.
And Eric's joining me today for my designer diary. We'll be talking about what it's like to choose classes for the core set for Erudia, Battle of Birthrights.
So first of all, we had to decide on a number of how many, right? So we have 8 primary factions, and then we also have 4 boosters, which are different from your normal classes because they are just secondary factions.
Right, and when you combine those together, you're going to get 88 unique combinations, which is a ton of replayability, but how we got there is a story in and of itself, which I'll be sharing with, and it gives you a lot of insight into the design process that I'm really excited about.
So first of all, how many factions, because you told me once, and I have the worst memory, how many factions did you, before, because I know since we started, you've added a few more from the pool that you can pull from. But how many factions did you have to choose from for ideas?
At the time that we were choosing the core set?
Yeah.
Probably 40.
40?
Yeah.
And now we have how many in reserve?
So there is a specified, this is a political answer, but because there's more classes than room in the game to make sure that everything, you get the best of the best and that we don't look like we're running out of ideas. But I have personally designed 90 different classes.
90. And when we do all said and done, including all the expansions, how many factions are there going to be?
Well, I'm not going to answer that because then you know how many expansions there are. And also, the number, you would get the math wrong, and I don't want to talk about.
Right, because of community content that we're going to create. Right. So there's, even though we design factions, and we have like 90 some factions to pick from, some of those are going to be designed by the community themselves.
Well, actually, I was ignoring those. Some of those are never going to see the light of day because they're going to get replaced by community content stuff. Because we wanted to make sure that there is, you want to have enough content to do the whole vision, but you also want to offer up some sacrifices to say, okay, for the good of this initiative, if we had to kick stuff out and put in other people's ideas, are we fine either way? And that's why everything has existed, and I'm saying that there's not going to be enough room.
Gotcha.
So a lot more than we'll be able to include, can't include everything, unless I somehow stumble upon infinite money. But at the time, there would have been about 40.
Gotcha. So let's talk about the factions that did make the cut, and the ones that almost made the cut, and give a few teasers that didn't make the cut, but we'll see in the future.
Sure.
So first of all, what do we have in there that you think are the key and backbone of the game?
Great question. So to start with, we have the 8 primary and the 4 boosters. Now, it wasn't always going to be 8 and 4. In fact, this is a decision in and of itself, because you want to have a core set that has a ton of replayability while also offering great diversity among the playstyles and appealing to a number of people, but also not costing a fortune. So we have the content and the ideas that we could throw in as many things as we want, but you want to find a good number. So I started to think, well, it was always going to be primary and secondary, and one of the great things about that is that it essentially doubles your replayability. If you're playing knight fighters, it's not the same as playing fighter knights, so instead of your typical combination, you get double that. So if we started with 6, for example, that should be 30 if I'm doing the math right in my head, which is a good amount. But from a fact that you're primarily getting your direction from your primary, which is a design goal of the game, you kind of want to emphasize that number a little bit more to make sure that they are truly unique. And also the idea of the booster is that you're getting a completely different experience from the booster, one that doesn't exist in the primary, so you can do these cool things that wouldn't fit in a 30 card primary. So is it 6? Is it 7? Now, I can't do odd numbers. I can't. I just can't. So if it's either going to be 6, it's going to be 8, or it's going to be 10. I looked at other games that I had enjoyed. Smash Up has 8. Guardians has 10. Guardians, you pick 3. Smash Up, you pick 2. So I'm trying to decide, okay, what's the right balance, knowing that we want to get the boosters? And I thought it was going to be 6. In fact, I've made no secret that the game is heavily inspired by Final Fantasy. And in the original Final Fantasy, there were 6 classes that you could choose from: fighter, thief, monk, red mage, white mage, black mage. It's like, great, done. Yeah. Those 6.
Yeah.
Except there's a couple problems.
Because all those were in the pool to pick from.
Right. But there's a couple of problems with that. Number one, when you look at the actual abilities, there's not a lot of diversity there. You've got 3 physical, 3 magical, which is a nice balance, and Thanos would be happy, but I wouldn't be happy because there's a couple of problems. Number one is that you got a lot of antagonism in the monks and especially the fighters. Mm-hmm. And the fighters in a narrow playing set could be really, really hard to do if you don't have a lot of different ways that you could approach them. So that's one problem. The other thing that you kind of want to avoid is a dominant, obvious pairing in the core set. Because if you get one of those and someone gets it, then that's going to be a problem. Now, I don't believe that there are any dominant pairings in the core set. I feel good about anything else, anything you give me. I'm like, great, I'm going to win. I'm going to compete. So with the red mages and the black mages, now it's clear, I'm using those terms because they're historical. So the white mages and the black mages are the clerics and the wizards. I wanted to call them that, but I also didn't want to get sued. So we went with the more familiar clerics and wizards.
Yeah, yeah.
So
copyright-free names.
Yeah, which is strange because they're so bland and ordinary, but they mean so much to so many people. Mm-hmm. So a cleric, a white mage, is going to be your support defensive magic, and your wizard is going to be your offensive magic. Well, a red mage is a little bit of everything. It's a jack of all trades. They can do white magic and black magic in Final Fantasy. So naturally, there's a pairing there with black mages or white mages that wouldn't exist with the other 3. And so that's something that you want to avoid. So you need to widen it a little bit more. So how about 8? Okay, and there is a lot of candidates that can go, and 8 seems like a really good number as well. Well, who do you start bringing in? And that's where you got to start thinking about the types of personalities that you want in both the classes and the player base. You have to have a little bit of antagonism because there's a lot of people who like to play like jerks.
Yeah, yeah.
And you have that with the fighters. Well, there's a question of, is 1 enough? Is 1 too many? There's a lot of risk in putting antagonism in the core set because you don't want to take that reputation. So I thought, okay, who would be a possible different form of antagonism to bring in the primary? And one of the first ones that I created was actually the witches to honor Ogre Battle, because Ogre Battle is also a very big influence in this game. And the witches do antagonism in a very different way, not necessarily damage-based for fighters, but it's still antagonism. There's still the element of take that. So that's not a no, but it's not a yes either. But I also noticed that there's no swarm in the game. Swarm being, a lot of units, maybe smaller power where you're trying to break through on quantity rather than quality. And it's like, which swarm do you give them? Now, I don't want to give them just pure swarm. That's a problem. So it's like, okay, there's a number of swarms, but it's like, which one is really interesting that does something that you wouldn't expect, but that you'd grow to appreciate? And I'm looking through the list, and I'm going through the list, and then I go to page 2, and it's like, scouts. And I'm like, huh. Now it's interesting because, can you think of any video game correlations with scouts?
So my width and depth of video games is not very high or deep.
Right, but you do a lot of RPG stuff.
Right.
Like, there's no D&D class scout.
Right. Like, the most I would imagine would be like a ranger.
Right, but they're not rangers.
They're not, even though there are some bows.
Right. But it's interesting because in all these RPGs, they're always talking about, like, our scouts have reported back with this information.
Right.
But no one is ever actually the scout.
You never see the scouts. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, well, that's kind of weird.
Yeah.
So it's like, it may not be the most thematically appealing, but they are swarm, but yet they're also so much more than that. And they also give you deck manipulation. Mm-hmm. Well, not deck manipulation, deck foresight, because they know what's coming. They can't necessarily do anything about it, but they use that. And I thought that they had this super cool idea of I know what's coming, and I'm going to time my deploys. And it's really interesting to think that, the scouts were so far down on the list that they, to think of them not being in the core set would be kind of weird at this point.
Yeah, because the way I looked at, when we talked about making this video, I thought about what all the different factions are and what they bring to the table. And I'm like, each faction brings a certain element to the game that is basically like the building block for the game on how the game is supposed to be played or can be played. For example, scouts fundamentally teach you how and what deploys are and how they can be used.
Right. And you're actually going to see a lot of deploying over the course of the game. It's not just with the Isidos, the royal item, that can put deploying in every game, but the scouts are one way of using the deploy mechanic. And it's interesting that you bring that up, because that's the approach that I start to take, which is, what is the value from a rules perspective of getting in the core set? Because there's a high desire to have one rule book that says, these are the Erudia rules, not version 1, version 2, version 3.
Yeah.
That creates its own problems, which I'll talk about in some other future video. But to really give a representative sample of the rules, I had to start thinking, okay, how do we bring in as much of the core set as possible, and what gives a good representation, like you're saying with deploying? Because deck foresight doesn't really have a lot of rules. There is a section in there, but deploying, yeah, you got to know exactly what it is in order to make it work. So then I start to think, what are those building blocks that you're talking about? And that's where the knights start to enter the picture. The knights are weapons. Weapons play a tremendous role. You see weapons all the time. Like, I'm trying to think. I don't think that there is a single expansion that doesn't have at least one weapon in some form.
Yeah.
Now, all right, so you've got the idea of the weapons, you've got the tokens, shields become it's not just a thing that you can do, it's an integral part of their strategy, and now things are really starting to take shape. And they also give you a different tempo. Like, scouts can be very fast, very fast. Knights can be fast, but most of the time they're spreading out, slow, very methodical.
Yep.
So we're starting to get diversity there. So now, if you're playing at home, we're at 9. We've got the 6 original Final Fantasy ones. We've got the scouts, we've got the witches, and we've got the knights. But no, I'm going to make it harder. I'm going to go in and do some more. So, okay, there's the fighters, and at the point of the time, it's not clear if clerics are going to be the direct counter to the fighters. And the reason why that is because free damage has not yet evolved in terms of the game. You don't know how people are going to react to it. So clerics could have a bunch of healing, but not actually use it at all. So they've got to find their own identity. There was a joke in college with one of my friends freshman year. He played Final Fantasy XI, which I've never played. It's an MMORPG. But his main character was a white mage. Now imagine playing a D&D inspired game where you're playing by yourself and you're a cleric.
Yeah.
Like, that just seems wrong to me, where it's like, my job is to heal the party that I really don't have.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, okay, if that's not the antithesis of fighters, and it's not necessarily knights, what if we throw in the phalanx? Now, some people may not know what a phalanx is. I would kind of describe it as, it has origins in ancient Greek, with the idea of like shields holding the line. You kind of see this in Black Panther with the shield tribe, how they form a barrier with all their units. And that's what they do in Ogre Battle as well. And so they're very defensive oriented, and what they do, I'll talk about their defense. They kind of like want to push people out of the way and, increase the resistance of battlefields, but they do something very particular that I'm not going to say, that I absolutely love, and I salivate over this idea, but it is a terrible idea in the core set. Like, this is not something that you would ask somebody to do when they're playing their first game. So, unfortunately, like, I really want to include them, but I could also see that, all right, now if we're going too much defensive, you've got knights, you've got clerics, you've got phalanx. One of those is going to have to go, but they're still on the list. So now we're up to 10. And thinking back on those introductory concepts, you've got actions which are well covered by the mage classes, especially wizards. you've got units, which are covered by swarm. What about items? Are knights kind of the defining item class, or are they not? Knights use items, but I wouldn't say that they're defined.
No, not since I think you're going with that.
Where am I going with?
Chemist.
Exactly.
Chemist, because they talk about not just because knights deal a lot with weapons,
right?
And weapons is a type of items, whereas chemists deal with consumable items, which is a whole another aspect of the game.
Exactly.
Which needs to be brought to the forefront of how the game is played.
Right. So we used to call them consumables. Now we call them reusables because we're still going to say consumable a lot because, again, this is a historical video. But the idea was that a consumable is a one-off that could easily be replicated. Now, I've talked about in other videos how I despise the chemist class in Final Fantasy. You know, literally wearing a Final Fantasy shirt, in case you couldn't figure it out. I despise this class. This class is basically begging to be played with a strategy guide. Because it's like A plus B equals nothing, A plus C equals nothing, A plus D equals random effect that isn't that great, A plus E equals, oh, that's amazing. Like, you either experiment or you use a strategy guide. Gotcha. So the idea of the ingredients is really, really there with water on acid, and it really tells you about the card hierarchy tree, that you have items that could be reusable, that you could have qualifiers with ingredients. The importance of qualifiers, all the rules about reusable items, you get those for free with chemists. And as a bonus, the chemists are one of the primary classes in Final Fantasy Tactics, which is a big inspiration. And I like that they're in the front. So now they're a contender, and we're up to 11.
Yep.
And we haven't even gotten into any boosters yet.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's like they're going to be a strong contender. They give you the item focus. Now, you've got all the card types, units, actions, and items well represented. What's the only other major card that's really not being reflected so far?
Movement.
Well, not necessarily, not even movement. We're talking about like literally cards. The most important one, the battlefields.
Right.
Now, there is a class that I tried desperately to get them into the core set. There just was not a lot of room. They're called the Geomancers. They control the earth in Final Fantasy, and these Geomancers control the terrains, and they care very much about terrains. We don't want to make it so that terrains are just tacked on. They have actual meaning, so you have all the objectives, and now you have a class that controls objectives and terrains and moves battlefields around and does all these cool battlefield type things. Well, there's a problem there because the objectives are still evolving at that point. And, you know, we actually talked about some potential abilities where an objective can move on its own. Like when a bridge moves once, the bridge moves twice. Well, it's really hard to balance that and the abilities at the same time of the class. So you got to let one stabilize before the other. So unfortunately, the Geomancers had to get kicked out a little bit down the line. They'll be here sooner rather than later. But so they were a strong consideration. They probably would have been the 9th if there was a way to make it work. But you know, now we're at 12. So if you're playing again from home, you've got the 6 Final Fantasy ones: Fighter, Thief, Monk, White Mage, Black Mage, and Red Mage. Wizards, Phalanx, Scouts, Knights, Chemists, and Geomancers.
Yeah.
Right? So that's a really good pool. So now we got to start kicking people out.
Yeah.
So Battle Mages, we've already announced that they're going to be in the A expansion. So clearly they're not in there. And if you've been following the videos, you know that they're not in there. Because there's already enough magic, we don't need more. So they're out, we're down to 11. The Phalanx, we've already got defense, they're out, we're down to 10. Now, who's left? Okay, so like we really want to include the Chemists, even though I hate the class. There's a lot of antagonism, you know, so the Witches have got to come out, and the Geomancers have got to come out.
For stability, got it.
Right. And so now we've got our 8. Again, so our 8 are Fighters, Thieves, Monks, Clerics, Wizards, Scouts, Knights, and Chemists.
Yeah.
Great. What's the problem?
Again, like I said earlier, we didn't have our movement that we need.
Right. Well,
one of the building blocks of the game.
So Thieves at the time actually had a lot more movement than they ended up with.
It did.
Yes. But if you're playing at home, you notice, wait a second, Monks where are the cavalry?
Yeah.
Because the cavalry are in the core set, they're in the demo game.
Right.
So where are they?
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, at the time that we're like building the team and bringing people on board, those are the 8. So what happened? Well, it's the same thing that I was talking about earlier with watching the game evolve. Because the monk, if you know Final Fantasy, if I say monk, you should immediately think counterattack. You punch me, I'm going to punch you back. That leads to the antagonism, but it also means, well, is someone going to punch you or not? Like, am I going to damage you? Is their whole thing, just like with clerics, being based on whether or not someone would heal, monks are based on whether or not someone attacks. And that's really hard to say in the core set because you don't know how people are going to respond. So it's a lot of risk. You've already got a risk with fighters and damage because that's antagonism, and clerics as well. If the healing is going to be meaningful, do you really want to add in another risk with the monks? So it's like, okay, what's not represented? Let's go back to the well. Is there an even swap? Because at this point, you know, like several months before then, I had decided on the 8. Now we're actually ready to start testing. And at that point, everybody else has been aligned with an expansion as part of a master plan. So what I really need is I need a trade. Who would make sense in one or the other? Now, it's very fortunate that the cavalry happen to be available in an expansion where the monks make sense. As a matter of fact, the monks make more sense in that expansion than in this one. Like, it will really, really make sense when it comes out. But so now we've got movement and all the movement resolutions, which is interesting because that's like a core set is all about learning timing of how cards work. And so there's playing and moving. And in hindsight, it's like, why wouldn't you include movement? Because there's so much movement there. Like, is movement simultaneous? Is it one at a time? You want to answer that question up front, and the cavalry are the right way to do it. So yeah, it's crazy to think that the cavalry that are in the demo, like literally one of the first 2 things
you learn from the game
were not supposed to be in there, and it just happened that they were the replacement, so to speak. So those are our 8. Those are the 8 that, you know, we decided to ship with. And how do we feel about this? Is this a good representation of the game? And I felt like it was. And with the players and polling them as to how they feel about, you know, the various classes, there's great support across the entire spread. Yeah. Like, who would you say is your favorite?
I think scouts are probably my favorite. The unpredictability nature of them, the fact that they know so much ahead of their own deck gives you the ability to plan ahead. It's nothing is more fun than saying, I'm only going to draw 1 card in my turn, and just seeing the other guy go, oh no.
That's such a great thing. And it's interesting because that rule was actually not originally there. That was added for the scouts. Well, there's other people who benefit a lot from it, but primarily, like, that's one of the interesting takeaways of having these factions early. Another thing is that by having the scouts and the deck foresight, it really forces you to reference everything in terms of a deck, not your deck or my deck. It's all about a deck. Because now you can look at the treasury.
You can look at the treasury. You can look at the base deck. I love, is it Tine? Tine, I forget to pronounce the name wrong.
That's how it's pronounced. I don't care. Like, I choose how to pronounce them all.
You literally made up the name. You can call it whatever you want.
Well, she's a famous historical explorer.
Oh, is she?
But I'm just assuming that she's pronounced Tine.
Gotcha.
In Erudia, you know.
With their dialect, right. And so the ability to look at the base deck and like go, no, we're going to go to this one next, and you just switch the order of the bases is great. And I was doing a play test on the expansion where someone did that, and it had monumental effects. And it was like, that's incredible. I was so happy I saw that happen. Even though it was against me, it was an amazing thing to watch.
And she only gets even more relevant because there are eventually going to be other decks, like a side deck.
Yeah.
And because she can do decks in general, that works 100%. And so it having them, you know, we don't necessarily do that and make that be as general if the scouts aren't in the core set.
So let me ask you a question. You just mentioned side decks. I wasn't going to bring this up, but since you did, I'm going to ask you.
Sure.
Why don't we have a faction with side decks in the base game?
Honestly, it's a logistical issue. Because the way that you assemble the card sheets, there is no room. Like we
Yeah.
you know, like something I learned is that, you know, card sheets are either a full sheet or a half sheet. And with all the cards that we have which is, you know, we haven't even gotten into the boosters yet. But there's mathematically no room.
Yeah.
So
that's the simple short answer of it. There's just no room for
yes. If all goes according to plan, they will be seen sooner rather than later.
Okay.
In community content.
All right.
Yeah.
I think I know where you're going with this. I think I remember seeing.
We talked about this before.
Yeah.
And we had to actually, you know, make sure that would, like, we don't have room now. Will we have room then?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's your spoiler. Side decks are coming sooner rather than later.
Mm-hmm. And for some of us who never played Final Fantasy, like, I had to learn what side decks was. Could you briefly, for those that
it actually has
like
nothing
me,
to do with Final Fantasy.
What is it then from? What was it? Because
side deck is just a general card game concept. It really lends itself. The backstory is I was explaining it in the lens of Final Fantasy and how it makes so much sense to solve certain Final Fantasy problems as a side deck. Well, it just means a set of cards, actually treasures and monsters would technically be considered side decks.
Okay, gotcha.
That you interact with, you can't draw from them normally.
Like our treasury deck is our side deck.
One that you always have access to, but a side deck might be a class-specific one. Like if you were using this class, they bring in these things.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you. For some of us who are not as in card games as much as others.
Actually, that's come up a lot. People who don't know what a side deck is.
All right.
So, and then just going back to the rules, you know, there was always going to be thieves. Like, come on.
You had to get your namesake in there, and it was lovely because I love in the artwork. There's so many tie-ins to. I don't think I even discovered them all yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's crazy because, so the Bandit, obviously I'm the Bandit, but in the portrait, you know, we got a couple of sketches, and I'm basically standing with my arms crossed. Now, if you've ever seen me in real life, 75% of the time, my arms are crossed.
Yeah.
That's just my natural pose.
Yeah.
And so when it's a question of which, like, that's literally how I look like I'm standing.
Yeah.
But you'll see a lot of Easter eggs in Bandit's lair.
Yep.
Including my cat.
Yeah. Yeah. I was like, there's Blossom, there's the cat.
Yeah. So thieves are always going to be there, but you want the cloaking rules.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
cloaking rules are a huge aspect of the game.
It's an entire page.
Yeah, it's an entire page. And the one thing I love about our treasury deck is that it basically pulls from every faction one of their key mechanics, and it brings it so that any faction can have that ability if you so choose.
Right, so that those rules are there in every game.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Isidos for deploying, or the Cloak of Sharon for cloaking. Exactly. It makes it so that these are not one-off rules. Cloaking is an integral part of the game, and you're going to see a cloaking a lot in surprising ways, but you could also have it every single game.
Yeah. So one of the things I really like about the royal items is that they bring an aspect of each of the different classes to whatever game you want. So if you are playing, say, knights, but you want some movement, throw Sylvan Boots on them and they can move around the battlefield. Or what I love to do is put Boots and the Cloak on Marco, my favorite acolyte, and just have him move around and drop and deploy units the entire game if I can. Like, my goal is to keep that guy out there the entire time.
And it's funny that you mentioned the Sylvan Boots, because that's the obvious cavalry item.
Yeah.
Yet the Sylvan Boots existed before the cavalry did.
Oh, did it?
Yeah. The Sylvan Boots was actually like royal item number 3.
Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, the royal items came first.
Yeah.
Like, you know, there's going to be a cloaking royal item. There's going to be an Enduring Idol searching for it, the Blade of Erudia, for like the big leader card. But yeah, it ended up being really nice that the Tears of Undying is the reusable representing the chemists.
Yeah.
And then you've got the cloak, you've got the boots. The boots are going to hold down the fort until the cavalry arrived.
Yeah.
But it's funny how that worked out.
So that's interesting because I totally thought the egg came first. I totally thought the classes were first, and then you derived a royal item from each faction.
Nope.
But it was really like you just had a list and they were just mirrored. Like it sounds like the treasury items had all the fundamental aspects of the games the rules that we needed, and then we just got classes. I can really keep messing that up. Of that mirrored the main rule types. It's
a little bit of both. Each royal item has its own history. Like the Aegis Shield came later, the Bevian Glaive came later. There were some royal items that were good, but proved to be unnecessary. But we always have those in our back pocket. Not that we'll ever get to use them because we don't design the royal items anymore. You do.
Yes, I remember our first poll in the playtesting Discord about the next royal item, and there were like a few that were up there that was really cool. I think even some red herrings that weren't going to be possible.
Yeah, and you were the runner-up.
Yeah, really?
Yeah.
That was all right.
Thought you knew that.
I can't remember every little thing, but there was a lot.
So it's I mean, we could talk more about the history of royal items later, but they were largely chosen before the core set was chosen, and it's just interesting how it ended up aligning because, it really reinforces you don't want to have a rule like a page of cloaking just for this one card that someone might not even take. No, you want the thieves to be in there. Yeah, and thieves aren't the only ones with cloaking in the core set anyway, so that's really appropriate.
So we talked about the 8 primary factions, and different rules and mechanics that they bring to the game, but we haven't talked about the boosters yet. And I have some theories about why we selected them as we do. But
sure. Well, so the first thing, again, you have to arrive at the number. So originally it was going to be 1, but again, I can't do odd numbers. And it also seems kind of odd, no pun intended, because why just have 1? If you're really trying to flesh out an idea, it's got to be 2, so that like I can take the booster and you can take the booster. Right. And also, because it's a really well-formed idea, it also lends itself to the demo set where, originally it was, primary, booster. And so both people get to experience that. So it's got to be 2. But which 2? And that was really, really hard. But your brother actually, I was talking to him at work one day, and he was saying it should be 4. And I'm like, you're insane. And he's like, I think it should be 4. And so he planted the seed that it should be 4. And this is before all budgeting is set. Yeah. And now I got emotionally attached to the idea that there's 4. That there's 8, there's 4. I did the math. How many combinations is that? It's 88. I'm like, that's great. That's a lot.
So just out of curiosity, what was his argument for 4?
There was no argument. He said, I think there should be 4.
That's weird because normally he had like, no, it's because of this reason or because it's like half of the primary deck or whatever. You know what I mean?
Right. And so, so which 4 now are they going to be? Well, always were the Hivions going to be in the core set because the Hivions are my favorite. They are the definition of what a booster should be to me. They also grow over time. We recently announced that there are secret acolytes in certain classes, and the Hivions are the best example. Like, you will be getting Theta, the new Hivion acolyte, in the A expansion, so you got to have them in there, and you've got to establish that precedent early.
Yeah, which means, for y'all to understand, a booster has 5 acolytes, and you draft one of them, which now, by having a 6th acolyte, you're now having to pick between the 6 that you're going to have in your secondary faction. And so you're not only just drafting your royal items, but then you're drafting your acolytes of who you want to take, which is more customizations and more variable gameplay.
Right, because we asked people recently, knowing what Theta does, who would you kick out? And everybody agreed, not Zeta. But that's all that they could agree on. Yeah.
And then I literally played a game with them, and I kicked out someone, and I'm like, immediately go, crap, I should have had that person. And
I had the same thing where I kicked out the wrong person. Yeah. So that just shows the importance of the Hivions and why they've got to be in there.
I almost wanted to kick one of my primary acolytes out. I'm like, no, I'm sorry, I got to make room for.
No, it doesn't work like that.
It doesn't work.
So dragons, really easy to explain. They're the most popular booster. They've got to be in. What were your theories as to why we chose
So Hivions was because they really show the dynamics of the acolytes.
Okay.
Fairies, because fairies is the only one that bring in the concept of your opponent chooses your answer. It chooses the fate that you're going to use. Whether you attack or command or however you get the ability, you have two choices. And the other player decides which of the two you use, which is a mechanic with the game that I felt absolutely needed to be explained early on. And that was what the fairies brought to the table, as well as additional leaders.
That's really interesting. It's wrong, but it's interesting.
Oh, cool.
No, because I had nothing to do with the fairies. Well, I mean, that's not true. I had a say in the fairies, but I'm not the only one who had a say, because that was our community content one. So there's no way, I'm good, I'm not that good.
Yeah.
There's no way I could have predicted that.
The other one's skeletons. I don't really know. I think it. Let me pull up my notes. Hold on before I start talking. Skeletons. All right. Nope, that's a pun. Something about, they all have printed value of zeros, so they don't have any meat on their bones. For those that enjoy puns and actually intend their puns.
It actually has to do with the fact that they're zero.
Yeah, they're all printed value of zero, and they all have unique ways of gaining strength, be it strength, unit presence, or they just simply gain a strength token every turn.
Right.
And how they use those strengths to their advantage to do unique things is very unique. But what they brought to the table was you're discarding and leveraging the discard to your advantage. That's what I have written down.
But they're not the only ones who are going to do that. But what the skeletons really do is that they show you the nature of power and the nature of health, and the fact that the two are not the same.
Right.
That more often than not, you'll see power equals health. We actively look for opportunities where that is not the case, and the skeletons, for me to say, this has no power whatsoever, and I love these things.
Yeah.
It's truly great that it shows you that power is just a number, and that ability matters so much.
Going off my earlier thing where I thought royal items came from factions, I was like, oh, Memento came from skeletons, which is, of course, as we discovered early on, completely false and had nothing relevance, but my brain made ties and connections that weren't there.
Sure, there's a condition for that. But no. So when it was 2, it was really tough, because it's like dragons or skeletons, that's really hard. But because I had my mindset on 4, that they became the third one.
Yeah.
So community content, though, fairies aren't necessarily in the books. What happens if it's not going to be fairies? Well, we had committed to the idea of doing the community content, but you never know how it's going to work out until you do it. And fortunately, it worked out really great. Well, what if it doesn't? What if it tanks? Yeah. Well, again, at the time, the cavalry were not in the core set, so a movement booster was going to go in its place. And I'm not going to say who the movement booster is, although I'll say that it's fairly obvious if you know the source material. But
cool. So I'm in the blank.
Yeah.
I'm in the dark. I'll guess later on.
So that would make sense if the cavalry weren't there. But now at this point, the cavalry are in, so it's not going to be them. And I can pull from a whole roster because I have plenty of boosters. But it's like, no, we really want to do the community content. So I settled on fairies because of their presence in Ogre Battle and the fact that there's a lot you can do with them. But I said antagonism with the point, because witches were out and I was sore about that. So I said non-damage antagonism with the point. And that led to mess with the mind of your opponent, and it's absolutely great.
It's fun because we throw it in with Tina and be like, so Tina would go, if you choose the faction that I think you're going to pick, or the option you're going to pick, I get a bonus.
Which may not amount to anything, but it's like, I can't let,
I don't want to give you that bonus.
Right.
But you can kind of shape, like I've done some things where I'm like, I want them to pick the other option, so I'm going to make if they choose the first option, I'm going to get the bonus one way. You know what I mean? So it kind of equals out my choices. But there's times when I play Jim where I'm like, I want him to pick the other one, and so I'll put the token on the one that I want him to pick. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like
There's actually
like just to mess with him. He goes, wait a minute, he doesn't want to play a unit. Why is he doesn't want me to play a unit? What's going on here?
So there was a game that I lost to you because I chose badly on Mab.
Yeah.
And it's like I gave you the one thing that you had.
Yeah.
And it's like I cost myself the game because it's like, tell me what kind of card do you want to play? And I'm like, I want you to play an action. And you're like, good.
Like, because that's all I got. And I just like played my actions, and he's like, son of a.
But it's great. It shows off the power of community content, and it fit in well because none of the boosters really add all that much in terms of rules. The fairies being the exception with Fate.
Yeah.
Which is going to be in there regardless because Fate is used. But obviously Titania is a type of card that you'd want to explain in the rule books. People would be like, what?
Yeah.
So, at that point, the idea is it's got to be 4. So you reserve space for people to do their thing, and that's how we ended up with the 8 and the 4 that we have.
So let me kind of ask you a question, because most people, probably like me, who just played a lot of Smash Up, is like, well, they're same no matter which way you put it, right? Primaries are 30, and secondaries are 15.
Yeah.
Right. So, but we have boosters. So that's a primary faction can be a primary and a secondary. A booster can only be a secondary.
Right.
What makes you go, this faction can only be a booster, instead of going, this faction should have a primary and secondary, this faction or the class should only be a booster?
Right. So if you notice, the primaries are all humans.
Okay.
Like, it wouldn't make sense that they're meant to supplement your army, and this comes directly from Ogre Battle. Because Ogre Battle, you had to have a human leader. You could have a leader and 2 dragons, or a leader and 2 golems, or whatever. But you couldn't just have like a bunch of golems roaming the field as a unit. Well, if you are a brother and you are trying to hate, you hate your brother and you're trying to, kill him essentially.
Yeah.
You're not going to hire a bunch of dragons to do it.
Yeah.
Like, this doesn't make sense. Like, I'm going to hire an army of dragons to fight my battles. Like, no, they're meant to supplement. So it tends to be, thematically, they tend to be more creatures and world building. So, all right, you've got the Hivions, which are a class that, a race that I existed, that I created. But dragons obviously, come from mythology, skeletons, and all that stuff. So theme plays a large role in it, but also mechanics. You can't have 30 cards all saying draw a card. It would get old very quickly. So when you have an idea that really wouldn't work in a full-size setting, that's where the booster comes in. That movement booster that I talked about uses movement in a very different way than the cavalry does, because the cavalry has the density to support the idea of moving multiple times, because you'll have a chance to see all those cards, and you'll be guaranteed a certain amount of movement. You can't do that in the movement booster, so you've got to cut corners and say, okay, movement with a purpose and a specific end goal for it. So it really comes down to theme, does it make sense in the world, and mechanics as well.
Okay, cool. I was wondering what made it like this has to be a booster. I'm like, why does it have to be a booster? But yeah, that makes sense. All right, anything else you want to talk about? I think we got it covered.
I mean, yeah, there is one thing.
Okay.
Which is how difficult this is from a I hope you're right perspective.
Right, because you're banking the success of the game off of your base game. Like, if your base game doesn't have good enough content, then people aren't going to continue.
And so that's why I have a strict love them or lose them policy. I don't ask we ask the team all the time, how do they feel about certain things? Not everybody likes everything, but in general, everybody likes most. Now, not everybody has to love them, but I have to love them, because I'm saying that at the time I had 40, I chose you 8. There is no room for someone that I am not thrilled about. And then I do that at the card level as well. There's only 2 cards in the core set that I'm really like, I wish I could squeeze just a little bit more, but for balance reasons I can't.
Yeah.
And they just got to stay where they are. But you roll that up to the classes, and it's like, I have to be able to defend and preach and sell on all these classes. So you might have a test like, can I make a video about this? Can I speak passionately about these 8? And I can. I love all of these. If anyone comes after one of the classes, I'll be like, here's why you're wrong.
Yeah. They're like, this faction is really overwhelming. I'm like, no. Hold on. Have you tried X, Y, and Z yet?
Yeah. So super passionate, but you know, and then you when it comes down to picking the demo game, it's like there's a complexity range there. Now complexity is in the eye of the beholder. I totally get that. Who would you say is the most complex in the core set?
Complex. Honestly, I think a lot of people had issues with. It was actually a tie between chemist and thieves. People were having issues understanding cloaking.
Right.
But once people got past the cloaking, thieves became super usable and easy. Then it was chemist.
Right, but everybody figured out chemists, and then they loved them.
Yeah.
But the idea of, okay, the really big play that you're requiring certain cards in succession.
So if you want super big plays, I always consider the fighters to have a secondary turn or a booster turn during the ambush phase of capturing. There's so many big moves. Like I've played against you and I played against other people where you're the fighters and then I do my turn. I'm like, oh, I'm gonna break this base. I end up losing that base and another base because of the ambush phase.
Right.
And if you're talking about big plays, those are big plays.
Right.
Like if you're having a big play on someone else's turn, and then you have your turn where you're like, oh, I'm just going to recuperate now. And then you're like, oh, great.
So thieves unquestionably are the most complex in the core set because you have to understand the value proposition of cloaking. Fighters, I would actually put at number 2 because you can play them incorrectly.
Yes.
And you could play the fighters to your own disadvantage, where it's like, I'm going to try and kill everything. Like, that is not how you play them.
Yep, that's my notes right here. If you're playing fighters as a killing faction, you are seriously underutilizing their potential.
Right. And so that's an interesting question for the core set because it's like, I'm knowingly putting in a class that could be used improperly and could sour somebody on the game. That's a risk. At the same time, if you use them well and you can do a triple base break, it is so much fun and it is so satisfying. And like, we did our best to try and incentivize people to play them properly.
Yeah.
But when you play a good fighters combination, it is great, and they deserve to be in there, and they establish the damage precedent, knowing that okay, they have the most damage in the way that they do it. Everybody else has to do damage in service of something else.
Yeah.
So they deserve to be there. I call them my 8th favorite faction in the core set, only because they can be played wrong, but I still love them. They still pass the love and elusion test. So I would definitely include them again. I love how they came out, and I would stand by all of these classes. I just wish the Geomancers were in there.
Because that actually would bring out an aspect of the game that I love, because I love how the bases and where they're located matters so much, especially when you're talking about adjacency and nearby. And when you're like, hey, for example, cavalry, they have universal movement, but they also have one unit where it's like, hey, adjacency matters, and diagonally, you attack diagonally. And that's their only way they can move. And it suddenly brings into the game of, oh, I need that to be a particular base in order for me to, and then movement can be really restricted, especially because they got outposts, which is where it matters with adjacency, So
play an outpost and then Siren comes out and it's like, great, like that would show up next to the outpost.
Right, yeah. But just locking that base down is like, oh. But I've done a hard pivot to Siren with cavalry just to get off the battlefield.
That's also funny because that battlefield existed before the cavalry did.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man.
But it took out a new meaning when they were there.
Yeah.
So you can't fit in everything. We fit in a ton. To me, this is unprecedented levels of replayability with the depth. Because remember, it's not just the number of combinations, but there's different ways of playing each class. There's supposed to be 2 or 3 ways. Like with thieves, for example, you can lean into the cloaking. You can lean into the item stealing.
Yeah.
You can lean into their surprise plays that they have. all three are valid. So even just among that class, there's different ways to play them.
Yep.
Cavalry, you can play them the Pyrrhus way or the non-Pyrrhus way.
Yeah, that was my early take on cavalry. I was like, I'm going to take this guy who does damage when he moves and just wreck the battlefield with him. So while I'm wrecking you, I'm slowly building up my coalition. And whenever I see you building on somewhere, I'm going to do an efficient break, move a horseman over there that has suddenly 8 more power on him, and then break the base with 1 unit. And be like, all right, cool.
But that's also a great statement for the core set to say that, the lowest ranked unit is so valuable.
That's a recruit I just mentioned.
Yeah.
And it's like, everyone's like, recruits are just, pawns that you just throw at the enemy. And it's like, nah, I see a horseman out there. I forget where I was playing it. Someone had horsemen, and they kept playing it and moving them onto, I believe it was encampment, where they get shield and strength. And so not only they're just being buffed up, and it's like, I can't kill that guy. He has too much shields on him. Then I got rid of a cannon. But yeah.
So that's what it's like choosing a core set. It can be agonizing, but there is a ton of thought that goes into it, and you're really betting a lot on the success of the game with the 8 that you chose, but I would choose these 8 over again. The first expansion, I love all those. I will say that that's the one that really, whereas there's a ton of Ogre Battle and Final Fantasy and Scouts, somewhere the Scouts are in a game. There's a ton of influence spread out. The A expansion really feels like a Final Fantasy expansion, like a love letter. We've confirmed the battle mages will be in there, the red mages, we're calling them battle mages. We've teased another class that I'm pretty sure people will figure out sooner rather than later what they are. My favorite class hasn't even been mentioned yet at all in the A expansion, so I'm excited about that. Would I like to have any of those in the core set? Yes, but it also is comforting knowing that you have the confidence and the depth to go, okay, first expansion is going to be great, second expansion, third expansion, there's a plan.
One of the things that I've always felt about this game as we developed it and we looked at future factions and now that we're actually playtesting the next expansion is oftentimes people will go, oh, as you develop the game and you develop new aspects, the older factions become underpowered or irrelevant or doesn't employ some of the new mechanics. I've been playing some of the old factions with the new factions and the synergies that they have. Not just with the new factions, but with the new bases. Like there was one base that came out, guy put a horseman out there and then put a shield on him, and then they got a second shield. And so suddenly this horseman was health of 2, shield of 2, and suddenly I'm like, I can't kill this guy, and he can put a shield on him every single time and double his shields. And not double his shields, but put 2 shields on him. And so suddenly I had these horsemen that were just lumbering across the area, and he used like last stand on a horseman because he threw some equipment on him, and now his horseman with 6 shields. It's just a rovering giant, and I'm like, oh my god, I got to get rid of this base eventually. And it took too long breaking the base, but yeah.
I haven't had a chance to make this point in full with the secret acolytes, but what's really interesting to me is that you can play a class like, let's say, the Hivions, with all the royal items that get added, and the fact that the Hivions get added. Like, can you imagine, expansions down the line that you're playing Hivions, you've drafted 5 completely different Hivions from the core set Hivions, and 5 different treasury items.
Right, yeah. Your gameplay is completely different.
Right. It's like you're still playing Hivions, but it takes an entirely new meaning. And that's how you know that the core set is well designed, in my opinion, that it supports that. Yeah. It gives you a taste, but that taste never becomes irrelevant, which is what we're really trying to do.
Yep. All right. Now I think we got everything.
Now we got everything.
All right.
Thank you everyone so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed this. Please subscribe to the channel for the latest updates on Erudia. Make sure you try out the demo game. I'm Jim Price.
And let's shut it down.